Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Peter Hobbs. I'm the current president of the WA chapter of the Institute of Architects. This afternoon, we're here to discuss the idea of disruption in the current practice of architecture, and particularly how we respond to the twin threats of COVID and climate change, and how we as a profession will respond to technological changes in both workplace markets and in terms of the technology of the way we produce buildings. For this end, I've assembled a motley crew of architects who span some 50 years of practice. My team represents architects in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s, and I'll let you all guess which one of us represent that cohort. But to commence with, we have Renette Roux.
Hello.
Recently graduated and embarking on her career in architecture. Without putting words into her mouth, Renette represents a generation who is native to social media and other digital platforms, who would normally, in non-COVID times, be highly mobile and is, as her generation, reconsidering ideas and options as far as property ownership and employment goes. Tristan Morgan on my far right is an architect who is focused on technology and architecture and is on the cutting edge of design through digital technologies, and in particular, something called computational design. Computational design represents the interface between architecture and artificial intelligence. Tristan will tell us how computers can optimise buildings and their performance, reduce energy, improve efficiency, and actually reshape the way we plan cities. Sandy Angie on my far left, who you probably recognise from all the recent media, runs a multifaceted architecture practice, is a lawyer as well as an architect, edits an architectural magazine, and for the past 4 years has run the Historic Heart project aimed at reinvigorating the east end of town. We are proud to say also that she is the newly elected Deputy Lord Mayor of the City of Perth. And finally, Ross Donaldson is an architect who has reached the pinnacle of practice and until recently was the global president of the world's 6th largest architectural practice, Woods Bagot. Ross is a passionate climate warrior and understands that the existential threat that climate represents. Since buildings and cities contribute up to 35% of all greenhouse gases, Ross is urging the profession to find solutions to the reduction of energy in both the ways we build and then use our cities. But to the idea of disruption. When my grade 3 teacher, Mrs. Salisbury, used to tell me I was being disruptive, I'm not sure that she was being complimentary. The idea that disruption is necessarily a good thing is a new idea. Disruption speaks to the digital changes, the changes that digital technologies can make to challenge traditional work practices, making them reflexive, open and freely available. The most obvious case, of course, is Uber, which has transformed the way that we transport ourselves around. My son, for example, a young doctor, has done the sums and prefers Uber exclusively than owning a car. Great in principle, unless you're a taxi driver. Amazon has made shopping so easy. Sit on your couch and the world is your retail oyster. Fantastic if you're a Main Street retailer. Will Amazon destroy the Main Street and deny us that very human experience of meeting in markets, squeezing fruit, chatting to the vendor? Retail makes up a huge part of our cities. What will happen to the cities if we all go online for our retail? Disruption has also created a whole new elite, oligarchs, who are richer than Croesus and now wield enormous power. These people, the Elon Musks of the world, Jeff Bezos, shape the way we live without having been elected or having had any real conversation about what that might mean to markets and to us as a community. And now we have COVID. Government for years has been telling us that we need to live in denser urban centres so that we can make things like public transport more viable and to end the sprawl and the endless sort of spreading out into the suburbs. But how does this idea go intrinsically with the idea of social distancing? So Sandy, for the first question to start this going, how do you think the city will survive the challenges of online retailing and social distancing required by COVID?
Thanks, Peter. I think first in relation to retail, in addition to online shopping, one of the great challenges we're facing at the moment in our city and many others is competition from suburban shopping centres as well, with their massive investment in upgrades, including residential components. So I think the way that cities can compete with both online shopping and the suburban shopping centre is through the experience that we offer in a city. So it's so much more than shopping. You know, the point of difference that we have in Perth and sitting here right now is the history and culture of a city. You can't replicate this. Us sitting here today with the new WA Museum, our art gallery, sitting in an alfresco cafe in a unique neighbourhood, wandering interesting streets and laneways, enjoying public art, visiting cultural institutions, events, entertainment. You can't do any of this online. You know, so that's the point of difference we have that we really need to celebrate. And I think, you know, online will never compete with this. So I think the city, to survive these challenges, we need to build on the great things we have and to even make our experience of localhood and the city even better, you know, improve our vibrancy. And I think, you know, we're doing this in Perth really well, particularly through COVID. You know, and it's also about reimagining what the city of the future may be. So we probably won't have as many bricks and mortar shops with online retailing, but, you know, there's a real opportunity to increase our residential population. In the city of Perth, for example, our residential target is 90,000 by the year 2050. And so to get there, it's not just about setting a quota, but again, it's about, you know, really enhancing the experience of a city that we already have. And then in terms of COVID, the second part of Peter's question, there's so many impacts for cities here, and it's really accelerated trends that we're already seeing. Perth has been really fortunate, you know, and while we suffered a lockdown and social distancing was a problem in the early stages for local business, I think the enduring challenge that we're facing in our city, and it will continue to be, is the idea of working from home and the huge impact that this has on our city in terms of the loss of the daytime population and a customer base. So the solutions here are quite similar to those in relation to retail, and that's creating an even better city experience and leveraging off the assets that we've got to entice people out of their homes back to the office, you know, and looking to building the resilience of the city in the longer term. There's also many lessons to be learnt from around the world from COVID. From an architecture and planning point of view, you know, the obvious thing here is better apartment design. So if people are forced into lockdown, they've got a balcony, they've got natural ventilation. I think that's one of the key things that will come out of this. You know, from a social perspective, more outdoor areas. For example, I just heard that this is the first time that this event is being held outdoors. Normally it's held inside the library, but what a great opportunity for people just passing by to engage. So, you know, there's so many opportunities and lessons learned that have come out of this. And then really, I think what it is that, you know, the world's seen pandemics before, and there was a great article that my fellow panel member sent me from Norman Foster, and it talked about the other pandemics that we've suffered through history, tuberculosis and other things that have caused great changes to architecture and improvements to cities overall. So I think we ultimately, as Peter said, we can see disruption as an opportunity, but it definitely won't be the end of the city.
Renette, thanks, Andy. Renette, you're a younger person who can use the city. What does the city need to be for you? For a long time, we've called this the CPD, the Central Business District. But what do you think the city has to have to actually make it a place that you want to live in?
I think, unfortunately, being classified as a millennial, I try and fight it, but that's sort of the term that's used to describe my friendship group, even people I work with, like that, the largest chunk of us would fall under that whole millennial description. And with that comes a lot of disruptive ideas from a negative point of view, but in a positive way, what we want is that instant gratification. It's something we see in our approach to social media. It's something we see in our approach to the job force and the workforce. And, you know, we want everything now. And we put that and we just sort of translate that into the way we want to shape our city, want to see our city. We want to see it activated immediately. So when we leave work at 5 o'clock, there's no gap. There's no 2-hour quiet period before the city picks up again. We want to go from work to play immediately. In fact, we even want work and play to be the same thing. Tristan mentioned the idea of just everything being a Google campus the other day, and it really is, that's what we want. And in terms of how that looks in a city or how that looks in just Perth in general, I think it means a shorter connection time from wherever you're going, coming to and going to. And if you're leaving work, being within 100 meters of a strip of bars or 100 meters of a public space where people can gather in this manner. It might even mean that you're relatively close to your inner city apartment, which is something that doesn't come with the idea of owning property, which is such a thing that millennials kick against, and I kick against it, but Ross pointed out in some of our earlier discussions this week that it is essential to the country as a whole for us to still own property. So the way we want to do that is in a smaller scale. We want to do that in more multi-residential setting. We want it to be close to work. We don't want to own cars. I don't own a car. I'm 25 years old and I catch the bus and the train, but I Uber in a heartbeat, or Didi, or whichever rideshare app is offering the cheapest price at that time.
Yeah. It's interesting because at the moment it's still government policy that every apartment that gets built has to have a car park attached to it. And so you sort of think there's already, and then that adds about another $30,000, $40,000 to the price of the apartment. There's already things like that which are systemically embedded in our design codes, which are the things which need to change and adapt.
Yeah, and I think that's what we try and do, and especially from an architectural sense, we want to step outside of the classic description of what an architect is, and we want to collaborate, and we want to eliminate those things and change those systems so they suit modern thinking and the way we activate a city.
Right. So just taking it to a slightly new place, when I started my career in 1984, the first building specification I wrote was an IBM golf ball typewriter. And the pencils I did, the drawings I did were with pencils, ink and pens. If I made a mistake on a drawing, I would have to take out a razor blade and scratch the ink off my drawing. Faxes arrived in that same decade, and then computers the next decade after that. Today, very few architects actually draw by hand. Computer-aiding drafting has largely replaced that, and we can make fly-throughs and hyper-real renders within a week. As a profession, the way we design and draw has already been utterly disrupted then. In terms of construction, though, buildings are still largely hand-built. The oldest man-made material, bricks, have been used for 4,000 years and still comprise 90% of the buildings which are built. So, Ross, I put to you, cities consume vast amounts of energy. As we said before, 35% of all man-consumed energy is devoted to either building or running cities. Tell us what your research tells us about the disruption to existing design systems, construction and habitations of the cities to address climate. What do we need to do?
Thanks, Pete. Well, it's worth saying at the outset that I used to teach Peter as well when we were at university, and he was disruptive there as well, extremely so. So he's always been a bit of a pain in the neck, really.
Thanks, Ross.
I think the key thing with the climate change question is that we have to shift our focus from 2050, where a lot of people's focus still is, even if they're on board, to 2030. And that's a big shift from 30 years to 10. And I'll just share, I hope this doesn't get too dark to start off with, but I'll come to some light in a moment. The turning point for me in this appreciation was delivered by an amazing Danish scientist named Johan Rockström from the Potsdam Institute, who you may have heard on the ABC Science Show. He did 4 things recently. And just to pick a few things that he talked about is that 9 of the world's 15 major natural systems have already started to tip. The ice in the Arctic is now only about 1 or 2 years old. All the old ice is gone, and by 2030 it'll probably be clear ocean. in summer. That's not a big deal because it's already in the water, so that by itself is not going to raise the water level. But the western ice shelf in Antarctica is about to start moving, and it'll just roll into the sea. And that by itself will raise the sea level around the world by 2 metres, just that one thing. And we've already lost 50% of the Great Barrier Reef. So, you know, for me, these things were, well, you can't wait and see what's going to happen. So we have to decarbonise the construction industry in this decade, which is really not where people's focus is in this country. So it's a major shift. And to do that, our buildings will have to be, well, the lowest carbon impact you can have is to not demolish and not build. You reuse what you've got. And same with waste. You don't throw anything away. You shouldn't be throwing buildings away either. So the trend towards demolish and reconstruction has to stop, which should mean whether it's buildings in the city, whether they be residential or commercial or buildings in the suburb, we should be planning towards buildings being much more stable and have a longer life, and therefore they need to be built better. And they will then generate a low carbon footprint. And I think if we're really going to get serious about this, it's not too difficult to imagine in the future. Everyone will have a personal carbon footprint allocation. And whether you spend that on building a building or spending it on travel, that will then be your decision. And possibly you can even personally trade your carbon footprint. But the key thing is that the carbon impact has to be constrained in the construction industry to ultimately a zero carbon net impact. And that's going to change things a lot. So if buildings are built better, and if they're going to last longer, and they have to be smaller because one of the key factors is you don't build any more than you absolutely need. But if they're going to be built better and built longer, it could have big impacts for finance, for example, because why not attach the mortgage to the building rather than the individual? Because you can then have a look at maybe extending the length of mortgages from 30 years, where they're typically, to maybe 50 or 60. If you're doing that, then the individuals, including the millennials, can make a choice about how much they want to invest in building equity in the house they're living in, and how much they want to allocate to travel or wine or parties, whatever. Now that becomes a radical rethinking of how mortgages work, as well as how buildings are constructed.
So that's a radical idea when you think also that we might tell somebody that you've only got sort of 3 tonnes of carbon to spend on your house. I mean, we were observing the other day that some houses we see in the more affluent suburbs are 3,000 square metres, and yet I can build in a practice where I'm doing social housing. I can do 20 apartments in that space. So it's kind of like there is becoming an ethical issue, which starts being quite radical. You know.
Well, you go buying your carbon credits from the millennials who want to sell them because they want to go travelling.
You've got to be smart with how you work with your money, and if it's Bitcoin or carbon credits, you know.
You'll have to be flexible about it, otherwise it'll become draconian. But I think we'll have to start thinking creatively about those kinds of how you manage your personal input and where your personal commitment is, and how you use that flexibly with others. But I mean, I think the whole mortgage thing is a massive constraint, because the affordability of a residential unit in Australia has been dipping for the last 20 odd years. Every year there's 20,000 fewer mortgages and people going to rent. So that's a long-term decline, and ultimately that becomes a burden on the country, because if they're about 700,000 each and it's 20,000 a year and it's 30 years, that's $420 billion will shift from personal equity to company owning that. And when people get to retirement, they've lost that equity in their life, those assets that they can then use in retirement. They don't have an asset to leverage off. They have to keep paying rent. Ultimately, it's going to mean that the government's going to, and the taxpayer's going to have to cover that. I think it's a massive time bomb, the current trend, unless we find a way of tackling it. And if the millennials don't want to buy a house, that makes it even worse, because there'll be a burden on their children.
Well, the great thing is that we've actually got this new technology, though, which Tristan's going to tell us about, which is going to solve all of this with computational design. So we can probably all relax and let Tristan give us the solution.
Thank
So,
you.
do you want to tell us maybe what computational design means first, or is that you work into this?
No, it's probably important to kind of clarify. So I think Pete alluded to the way that technology has changed over at least his career, but certainly over a long time, and the way that we design buildings today is very, very different to the way we designed them 10 years ago and even 20 years ago. And the big shift has really been to move from the manual drawing board through to the digital drawing board and into this new space, which is, I would call it emerging, but it's really not anymore, which is this space of computational design, where a designer, rather than, I guess, designing objects and creating and modeling objects and drawing walls and doors and things, is actually designing the processes by which they come to be. So what this really means is that they start to consider the problem of urban design or building design through a different lens, a lens that's actually driven by the relationships between things, rather than the buildings themselves being static objects in the world. And what this really brings to the fore is this idea of embedding different types of information in the design environment. And the opportunity there is that we can start to draw on all these different data sources. Ross talks about carbon. We can start to bring the knowledge of the carbon impact of the things we design into the design process right at the beginning. We talk about the city and development. We can start to simulate and test all these ideas about the development of our city well before we put a shovel in the ground, well before we spend $1 actually building this infrastructure. And similarly with social things, we are able to actually see what happens if we have a bar here. What happens if we open, trading hours from here to here, public transport, all those kinds of things. So it's a massive field, obviously, but it's really emerging as this kind of redefinition or kind of reconfiguration in a way of the way that we think about design and when we conduct design. And the fantastic thing about it as well is that it's this living system. So you can continually iterate, we can continually test, and then we can also translate all these ideas and all this thinking into the other trades and professions as well. So we can move from a digital model through to an actual built object without wasting time with paper drawings, without possibly losing information in the process and having kind of problems crop up on site. So we can really streamline that process. And I think really critically, and this is a really important thing, is with the climate crisis and the need to kind of move to a zero carbon industry, we can actually be much more sure about the impact of what we build, and we can start to embrace all those opportunities that come through prefabrication, through modularized building, and also through using materials far more effectively than what we do now, because we have access to, or we can use the power of the computers we have to actually simulate the performance of the materials we use, so we can notionally use far less material and it can do far more work. I mean, I think that's a really big part of this. Yeah.
I guess as a live kind of example of how that might happen, you might say, I've got this much land and I want to get 1,000 people living on it, and I want to reduce the amount of energy that it will cost to build all those, that's 1,000 units. And you will say, the sun's over there, we know that the sun moves like that, so we're going to optimize the most number of windows to have heat coming in. And then you're going to say, but we can't be more than 5 stories, so you put that parameter in. And in fact, it's like, say, when you see these guys designing, you're not actually seeing lines on a drawing, you're seeing these kind of funny flow charts and equations where you can put a parameter in, you can put a formula in, and then you just say, then you press the button. So you put all these things in. So it's, height, and there's a river through there, and you've got 1,000 people here, and you press the button, and you see this kind of building, all of these options. So there's basically the advantage is that you can test thousands and thousands of options, in the blink of an eye. And so in 5 minutes, you'll have done every single permutation that of design that will meet and optimize that outcome.
Yeah, well, we call that data-informed or evidence-informed design. And what it does, it doesn't take away the authorship from a designer's point of view. What it does is it kind of becomes a foil, against which you design and you test what you're doing, and you kind of are able to embed or have just more accurate information and access that data. And sometimes, challenge your intuition.
And one of
Is
the
it-
key things in that, I think, is that because you can, and I think one of the key words you used there, Tristan, was relationship. You can measure the relationship between one element and another element, the kind of construction it's made of and its thermal performance and energy it uses, or the arrangement of spaces and how people are going to circulate through their predictive circulation patterns. But through all of that, you can optimize that. You can measure so that you're not building any more than you absolutely need to build, because you can actually measure these things quantitatively. And you can't do that manually, and you can't do it with a calculator. And I think that's it's brilliant that this time coincides with the challenges of climate change, and it'll feed into the COVID response as well about health and all that, health and welfare. So I think being able to quantify relationship and measures between one parameter, area, construction, height, site, sun, as Peter was saying, and the performance of the building on all levels means that we should be driving towards an era where we build less space because we'll only build as much as we need, and therefore massive changes in savings in the carbon thereby.
Is this, is this going to produce a Gothic cathedral though? I mean, is this going to give us the moment where your heart leaps?
No.
It already has when they updated the Sagrada Familia. Everything is data driven, and that is something that is amazing. It is in architecture, it is in medicine, it is in every field, even if you think it isn't. It is in everyday life, it is in everyday millennial life. You can, there are obviously so many dangers to social media. We're all aware of this. There's danger to everything. It's all about balance, but we as a generation are very happy to input that data into the systems, provide the data to better the world that we live in. We are also the setting these parameters. We're the living relationship and feedback. And as a generation, we feel an immense responsibility for our future and ourselves. We are extremely aware of what is happening, and we're really at the end point of that tunnel. It's not like we've got years and years to not worry about it. And so I think there is a general notion that, along with the combination of it taking approximately 11 years to be able to save for a deposit as an average, the idea is that we kick against owning a home or owning property, because the definition of that has always been the Australian dream and whatever, but we are redefining that to be something that is a building or apartment that takes responsibility for your carbon footprint. And yeah, maybe we would use some of it to travel rather than have a third, fourth bathroom. Yeah.
I was going to say, Sandy, now that you're in this position of authority in the city of Perth, I mean, what do you think is the Australian dream? Because my wife and I were in downtown East Perth yesterday and realised that it's actually become very cosmopolitan.
Yeah.
And it's not like backyards and hill hoist. The change has already come, hasn't it?
It's amazing. And just going back to the whole parametric design thing, I think the role for architects there is, determining what data actually goes in there to create the output, but also ensuring that in the output there's still a sense of place. And I think that's one thing that architects always talk about, and it's so important with a project. And being, as Peter mentioned, the editor of The Architect magazine, and our latest edition, which comes out at Christmas time, is about community. And all of those projects that are in there, the 10 projects and the WA museums in there as well, are all just so embedded in the place in which they're situated. And that's what makes them beautiful and makes them special. And I think that can't be lost in parametric design, that yes, you can have something that functions perfectly, that delivers the correct carbon footprint and has all the passive solar elements, but also addressing that sense of place is important. And as Peter said now, it's funny, just coming off the campaign trail and spending a lot of time door knocking residents and met quite a few people, retired, who've moved to the city. And they said they just thought the amenity was better. Two couples I met had moved from beachside suburbs into the city because they loved the walkability, and they were both couples were in East Perth, and that Claysbrook Cove area is beautiful. And there's a real sense of community. You walk down the street and there's people sitting on their balconies, enjoying their cup of tea, chatting to the neighbours, walking past on the footpath. And, and that's what we need in, not just our city, but our neighbourhoods. And I think that's something that came out of COVID, where people weren't happy locked inside their homes with the TV and the Netflix. There's no community there. The community's here, in the cultural centre, and that's what we're after. It's that intangible element of belonging that we're after.
And Tristan, you've got, almost three kids? So you're an example of a person who's has maybe moved from the millennial stage, but you're a sort of a young family. Could the city actually cater for your needs, or what would it need?
I mean, I think it could. I think there's always that dichotomy between amenity and then just space, and I think the prospect of space and I think the promise of what it represents. Often you don't want to have a city that is too highly curated, where there's kind of this loss of opportunity to create your own story or discover your own world, I think, and that may be something that the neighbourhoods in the suburbs offer in a way. And if I go back to the thing that I'm interested in most and the data kind of stuff, I feel like you can test for that. You can do things. You can simulate that. You can ensure that amongst all the options, you're creating a condition or a situation that is going to enable those kinds of things. You can sow the seeds for emergent kind of experience and emergent properties simply by setting the levers of how you might plan a space or design a space to do certain things. And I would also come back to, that idea of the Gothic cathedral being something. It is data driven, right? And it's just how you wield the data. The way that a Gothic cathedral is organised. So how do you think
Gothic cathedral is data driven? I mean,
well, it's the forms are driven by the material properties, by the structure, by what you can get away with and what you can't get away with, where the light is, where it comes into the space. It's how you wield it. That's the big thing. And so this is where the architect and the practice hand in that space is so important. It's not just about delivering, and this is the problem that we've kind of had in the last decade or 2 decades in architecture, I think, with the way that software has kind of overtaken the opportunity for architects to understand how it works. And what computational design has enabled is for the designer to wrest that control back, in a sense, to understand what's going on under the hood and wield that software, wield that data within a much more empathic way, a human-centered way, a carbon-centered way, whatever it is. It's about how you wield it and how much control you have over that space.
So I think the AI, it can't take... So the relief for me is that I'm not going to be made redundant by this machine.
No, but you have to remember that computational design, artificial intelligence, it's only sort of operating, it's only improving the workflow and the time things take so we can do more and do it better. Leonardo da Vinci used mathematics when inventing, designing. When architects have been using mathematics to create beautifully complex shapes that have taken a very long time to draw and to render. And, don't get me wrong, I am one of the people who loves hand drawing still. I stuck to it all through university, and maybe it's made me a little bit redundant even now, but it doesn't mean that beauty and that complexity is taken away, because everything is still sort of the foundation of everything in the world, in nature, is science, mathematics. Those patterns exist. Computational design is just speeding up the process, but we are still setting those types of parameters and deciding which formulas we're using. The
important ones.
Yeah, so beautiful architecture does not get removed through just using a computer
machine
to do it.
Ross, you want to get in here?
Yeah, it's another passionate subject of mine. I mean, one of my favourite things in the world is the emergent potential of computational design. But I think when we think about, your question about the Gothic cathedral, I mean, there's no question there's something that's magical about the psycho-emotional response of spaces like that. And you can have a form of that in your own home if it's well designed as well. And I think that comes back for me in terms of what architects have to contribute to society that's probably a bit more special and unique to their own field of practice. Kids, when they go into architecture, for the most part, I think, not uniquely so, have somewhere along their lives, they've developed a passion or a prowess or maybe even a talent for things in the visual arts. And I think what's going on there, particularly you see it when a kid, it's largely an unself-conscious, intuitive response to things visual and a fascination for that psycho-emotional response, albeit in an unself-conscious way. And I think that's the kind of orientation that brings so many young people into architecture. And we can't lose sight of that. Is, with all the tools around us, that is the thing that we probably most obliged to make as our contribution, our service to the communities within which we practice. Because as a profession, if we're not bringing that joy and wonder and those sometimes soaring psycho-emotional responses, or simply the wonderful feeling of comfort in your living room, whatever it is, then we're not doing our job. And we're not staying true to probably the core that brought us into the field of practice in the first place.
But the other thing, though, is that there is, and I passionately believe that good architecture should have an ethical underpinning and should be deeply motivated by public utility and social good. And that's where this is where the climate thing becomes really interesting, because we really do need to start taking control of this issue. As you say, it's very short.
Yeah.
As Ross said earlier, the most sustainable buildings are the ones that are there for hundreds of years. And so you can have something that's sustainable but also beautiful. And I've told this story many times, but I think my love of architecture started when I was 8 years old and I was fortunate to go on a trip to London with my parents. And I can still remember now walking through the Museum of Natural History and the beautiful volume of the museum and the dinosaurs. And I think that experience changed my life. And I think that's the power of architecture. And that museum building, I don't know the date it was built, but I'm guessing it's like a few hundred years old, if not more. And so that's a sustainable building, one that's there for centuries, that gives delight to people over and over again through generations. And I think, we can't let go of the fact that we have to address carbon footprint and sustainability, but building things that are enduring and things that are beautiful, they're not going to be knocked down. They're going to be giving back for generations to come.
Given we can't all live in the city, and we do have a suburban sort of underlay, what do you think will happen in suburbs? Anybody want to pick that one up? What will happen in our suburbs to make them more sustainable? We won't all be in the city.
They'll have to get denser.
Yeah.
So everybody needs more density.
Much denser, yeah. The trick is, and this will be some very creative work for architects and planners and all sorts of people, to manage that density, to manage the capacity of the increased population of the city, or the greater city, without destroying the amenity, without losing the amenity of the lifestyle that people love by living in the suburbs.
It's very contested, though. If you read the local newspapers, they're just full of this dispute, this tension between neighbourhoods trying to get a little bit more density into them and a little bit of height. And if you read the Netherlands Post, you'd be thinking somebody was going to get shot, and if they just asked to do a 3-storey building. It's quite extraordinary, the passion that this kind of change elicits from the local population, isn't it?
But I think that's something that is coming in my generation, and I guess the millennials, if we're putting it in that, if we're talking about it in that way, we have developed the idea of, like I said, what the Australian dream is, and home ownership. It's shifted. And so, for example, my sister and I live in a townhouse in Subi, and it's in central Subi on Rockaby Road. And every weeknight I can hear the music or the quiz in the pub behind us. I can hear music from a bar down the road. I can hear my neighbours walking up every Saturday morning at 7:45 sharp. The hairdressers under us start playing their music. And I get annoyed, but then I say, I tell myself I made the choice to do this. And the thing is, we make those kinds of choices, and then we sort of stick by it. And if we can design better homes, better townhouses that don't perhaps comprise of an old bank building that doesn't really deal well with the floor to floor and ceiling and whatnot, then we're tackling these issues. And we aren't exactly the generation who And I'm not saying other generations are, but I think if I can just speak broadly, we won't be the people, we're not interested in complaining that the bakery on the corner's bread smells too good for our dog. We love that. We love the community that is created there. And we like small footprints. There's this guilt attached to anything that isn't sustainable. There is a judgment. If you take a little plastic bag at the supermarket, I would rather put all my broccoli in my work handbag, and I've done it before, than take a plastic bag. I feel, and it's not a guilt that people would judge me, it's a guilt for just knowing what I'm doing, even on a small scale. And so knowing that, like this water bottle, I hate it. I've been sitting here and thinking, how am I going to take this home and do something with it? Because it's irresponsible. And we don't want to be irresponsible on a small scale, let alone a big scale. We don't want to be irresponsible with a home, because that means we're actually going to be irresponsible with our future children. And you wouldn't sit here with any of your children. Sandy, I know you've got a young daughter, and be irresponsible with her. And it's sort of, the big picture thinking is embedded into us. And I'm very grateful for that. And I'm grateful to be in a profession that collaborates and is collaborating a lot more with other professions and developing itself to be extremely relevant to the contemporary world and this rapid pace at which it develops, as well as a very intense relationship with the public and with everyone else. You know, I think architecture is really opening up, and as it should do. Yeah, that's my take on that.
I think it's great listening to Renette and her perspective on living in a city, living in effect in Subiaco, and then the point that Peter raised before about how do we address, you know, people not wanting density in their suburb. And I think it will be addressed in time, because the future generations, like Renette, they're happy to live, you know, with a sense of community, more inner city living. So I guess it's ingrained in a lot of, you know, I guess the older generations that we live with, that, you know, this is the way it always was, the quarter-acre block with the house on it. And, you know, I think it's just take time for that shift in thinking to happen. But obviously, you know, it's on the way.
A lot of older people moving into the city as well, though, isn't
Well, that's right. Well, that's the point I made before. But it's a shift in thinking. So if we can get that shift in thinking happening.
Okay, now I've been told that we're supposed to open the floor up to some questions, so fire away.
Good.
Oh, one in the back.
Hi there, can you hear me? Good.
Yes, good.
My name's Michael. Thank you very much for your discussion so far. I'm a councillor at the town of East Fremantle, and I'm an educated urban planner, but I work in business consulting and marketing now. One of my observations over the last 7 years of being a councillor, I'll wait for that to pass. One of my observations is that people don't disagree with the proposition of urban infill and what it can offer if it's done well. The challenge is, how do we do that well? And the insight I've gained from being a councillor is it's very hard in the WA planning system to plan for good design. We plan quantitatively, we do setbacks, height limits, but we don't plan for how do you provide good instruction, good design intent, and how do you actually assess buildings on the quality of their design. And so we're left to the limits of our construction industry, which is quite nascent in terms of how you match that with good architecture, with good design. So curious whether, do you share similar views, and if you do you have any comments on how we should shift our planning system to make it easier to realise good design?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a really important question, and so thanks, Michael. I mean, I think the thing is that the planning system is administered by people who are not trained to assess design. They're trained to assess a whole lot of sort of fairly static parameters around, as you say, setbacks and height. And so, and then yet how do you actually how do you legislate for good design? So there have already been steps taken, and in our regulations we now have something called the apartment design codes, which are very much designed about encouraging good design, and particularly encouraging good landscape, And just simple things like, in Melbourne, you can design a bedroom without a window, and which just seems an appalling idea to me. In our legislation, simple things like that can be so that's been prohibited. The thing that we have, though, is the biggest problem is not so much about the design of the individual building, but it's about the adjacency between something which is here and then something which might be here. And I think what we're not good at doing at the moment is dealing with that edge condition. But the most obvious way to improve design would just be to mandate all buildings of a certain size be designed by people who are trained to design them. And this is just a blatant plug for ourselves as a profession. But it would be, it's very frustrating when you see some buildings which get built in middle ring suburbs where clearly they haven't been designed by architects, and you can just see these major flaws. So, I'm very impressed that you put yourself into that position, because being a councillor is a thankless task. But I think so. Anybody else got something to say on that?
Well,
how do you?
We've got the Design WA document as a base, right, which is relatively recent and is continuously developing. And that looks at things like sustainability, cross-ventilation, having a window in your apartment. But
always good.
Always good. Well, I do agree with Pete. There could be sort of guidelines set in place that dictates that an architectural professional, we do study 5 years to be a graduate of architecture, and then we have to work and register to be called an architect. You wouldn't. It's a very simple comparison. You wouldn't let someone who's not an actual doctor perform surgery on you. You wouldn't get a person in the legal profession who isn't a lawyer to take on your court case. So why would you not get an architect who has two degrees plus to design your home? Because it's not about making a flashy home that you can't afford. They're here to make something that you can absolutely afford, that suits your lifestyle, and to provide something that is not only tailored to the individual whose home it is, but also to their neighbours and their environment, and by extension, the whole city. And that's a very simple concept when you think about it, really.
Yeah, it's a good point that Renee makes. I mean, in Europe and most of America, you actually have to use an architect to design buildings, residential, anything. And, I think, in Australia, here, it's not mandated that you use an architect. And then, with more complex buildings, when we're looking at increased density, I think that's where we see some issues. And so my background is I was a lawyer for 10 years, as Peter mentioned before. I studied architecture, and to be honest, the training for architecture I found more rigorous and more intense than the training to become a lawyer. We work hard to become architects, and I think there's a really valuable role that architects can play in increasing density in our suburbs in a way that is acceptable to people, in a way that is sensitive, that, as I mentioned before, that addresses this sense of place. Because I think a lot of the issues that come up, I know where I live, there's a lot of issues coming up at council at the moment that are going through council, being rejected and going to the SAT. And people are objecting not because they're against density, but because the sense of place isn't being addressed, that they feel like the fabric of their suburb with the heritage buildings and the tree-lined streets is being torn apart. And that's fair enough. And I think we need to balance density against maintaining character and, and quality of life.
Any other questions over there?
Thanks to the panel. My name is Wesley. You spoke earlier about disruption in things like Uber, meaning people will own fewer cars, and self-driving cars will probably make that even more prevalent, where you won't even need parking spaces in cities. How will you plan for cities in the future when it's even hard to understand what other technologies will disrupt and how cities will change?
Great question.
I'll throw one thought in there. I mean, it's probably only at best half an answer to the question, but if I keep talking, maybe I'll think of a bit more of the other half. But one of the opportunities that may come from the change away from cars and the release of the car parking spaces is the potential for urban agriculture, for example. There's going to be massive amounts of space that will become available, some of which will get sold off and developed, but a lot of that won't be so easily transferred into another use. So I hope that sensible thinking city decision makers will consider that, because we need to smash the carbon footprint of our food as well, and the kind of things that we're importing from South America or North America, depending on the season, or even Northern Europe, depending on the season. It's just got to stop, and that can be handled in that sort of situation.
Yeah, I mean, transport is a major part of the cost of a city, isn't it?
And the carbon footprint.
Yeah, and so if you can make these things, so you can imagine as you start losing roads and you start losing car parks, and then that becomes the equivalent of a common, so people can start growing their own veggies on little plots within the city. There's no reason that the city can't be considered to be a series of walkable neighbourhoods, rather than just this triangle of mass building.
But that urban agriculture could be on an urban scale as well. You think of the medium-rise car parks we've got in the city, where the ceiling level is too low to turn it into an office space or anything like that. Rather than demolishing it, put it out for tender to people to develop urban agriculture. And if the grid has become green, as it will, I think the grid will get very, very green within the next decade. Then go for it and grow your veggies there, but on an urban scale, an industrial scale.
But I also think, the question of how do you design for future cities is something, everyone is dealing with on a daily basis. And a very simple answer is no idea. No idea, because no one could have told you that this year we would be dealing with the COVID situation, the C word. And what that means is the way you can design for future cities is through staying extremely open and being able to adapt to situations. And if our buildings and our spaces are adaptable in general, then that covers a lot of, the issues. So a prime example of what you can do if something is adaptable. And it ties back to the whole ride sharing thing. You don't have parking spots for every person's car. Have a parking spot for a ride share car. Have less, so that really you're forcing people out of the car ownership thing. Because at the end of the day, you can't just keep providing an option. And then also, money shouldn't be, the concept should move away from those who have the cash and can afford things. It's, can you afford it based off your carbon sort of footprint, what you've been allocated, and it's not a matter of kind of just buying more the way you can just buy more car parks or a bigger house. This is what is allocated. Think laterally, make sure your lifestyle can adapt to it.
I think one last thing I'd add to that is that serious future casting and scenario planning by really serious thinkers being used in future imaginings of the city, rather than often quite stilted, the wrong mix of people thinking about where the city's going. I think it's not enough really serious future casting kind of thinking.
Any more out there? Yep. Oh. Two more. Maybe we've got time for two more.
Okay, thanks.
Oh.
I found the whole debate really, really interesting.
Thank you.
I totally appreciate good architectural design, but I also live in a suburb where I did not want my community destroyed by infill. What I want to know is, how are you going to persuade the developers? Because all of this revolves around money. And you as architects can't move forward unless somebody pays for it.
I think that's a very, very good question. And so, development is is the driver of these things. So I think the only way you can do that is by having the appropriate regulation that actually takes that into account, because the market is also quite a fluid thing. If a developer can only do something within a certain parameter, then you'll find that they're actually very adaptive. And in fact, good developers actually will pick up that trend quickly and be the leaders of it. So I think as long as the right levers are put in place, I'm pretty comfortable that we can bring this density in without it buggering up the community.
I do think there's alternative... Sorry, you finish.
Oh, well, I just think the other thing is that the consultation is obviously really part of that. So, I mean, you know, just having watched what's happening in America, you know, with the polarisation, we are becoming a polarised, a very polarised community, and we actually do need to start bringing these threads together so that people like Renette and Tristan, who can live in suburbs and then older people can live in cities with amenity, suburbs with amenity, which is going to mean tighter, denser suburbs, and not destroy the fabric of that you enjoy, which is the reason why you moved to that suburb. I would say though that, you know, all of us go travelling, and we all go, you know, well, we used to all go travelling when we go to Europe and we go to Asia, and we're kind of charmed by these sorts of vibrant cities, and yet we kind of really resist having them, and really resist having them in our own back garden.
Not everybody, but I do think there's another element that's not directly related to the infill question, but I think I believe we're going to see a whole range of new initiatives around funding for residential work particularly. And there's some interesting examples of this in Australia and other parts of the world that sometimes goes under the banner of cooperative housing. But the key thing is that you're harnessing the equity power of a group of people to do a development rather than their debt coming later. So what happens is a developer comes up with a concept, goes to some lending authority, gets the funding for it, puts it in place, and then sells it to you at a profit. The more sophisticated versions of cooperative housing collect a group of people with their individual collective equity potential and circumvent that developer profit. So you actually can get your, and there's actually banks in Australia that will give preferential funding to this kind of process. And you can save between 15 and 20% of the cost of the building. And the development is being driven by the group of people who are invested in it because they're going to live in it. And I think there's a great deal of potential there to fill that gap that's falling out of the market at the moment of affordability. If you can reduce the cost of a residential unit by 15 or 20% and start looking at things like more flexible mortgage arrangements that might last for longer, then you can really bring a lot more people back into the market. And maybe it's even appealing to the millennials because they're going to have a choice about how they mix it up.
We're open to everything.
So maybe any more? I think it's at the back.
At the back. No, is it at the back?
Oh, we've got two more. So this guy here first, and then the one at the back. Sorry.
Thank you. So just bringing it back to the point about climate change, it's, I guess, been discussed, like, I guess from your perspective as architects, how things will need to change, but like for us as people, how will our buildings and our cities need to be different in response to climate change? I guess one thing I can think of is more shade, but are there any other things that it will need to change as a result of like more heat, more drought, that sort of thing?
Well, firstly, materials will have to start being sustainable. So there's the I suppose the energy used to make a building, but then there's also the energy required to live in the building. So the first bit about the energy about making the building, it can be optimised through Tristan's remarkable software, and we can just then we can use new materials like timber is really coming back into the market.
Local production and manufacturing has to.
But then in terms of what the city looks like, if you think that transport's one of the biggest costs, then it'll be a place with shady streets that you can walk from A to B, and that within a 5 minute walk, most things are going to be accessible to you. So shops, you can go to the doctor, you can go to this pool to do some swimming, you know, you can exercise, you don't need to leave that place. So that's a really fundamental change. And I think, you know, like there are some cities in the world like LA, which are comprised of lots of these very vibrant, interconnected neighbourhoods. It'll probably be something more like that.
But also, sort of partly to your point about the heat and all that kind of thing, that the buildings will be have to be much better performing from a thermal point of view. There should be fewer air conditioners because of the the negative impact of those. So buildings will have to be much more passive designed. But I think you're right about shade, because if it's 2 degrees warmer on average, then it's going to be hot out here, isn't it? We might even need to get some shade over here next time.
And one more at the back.
Hi, hoping my question's a bit simpler. It's about architecture and community.
Yep.
So I live in Bayswater, and you go for a sunset walk at this time of night and everyone's out on the front porch having drinks, chatting to the walkers and the passers-by, and the dogs are out there. I'm wondering if you could comment on the removal of the front porch, particularly in modern homes and suburbs, and how that could be affecting the removal of the feeling of community.
Yeah, that was a really good point. That's one thing I really enjoyed about the COVID lockdown, Jessica, was that, the neighbourhood that I live in had never been so lively. Like, the local coffee shop was shut, but everyone had set up chairs and tables in the pocket park across from the cafe. People had set up chairs and tables in their front yards. They'd recreated a front porch where they didn't have one. And yeah, it's a really sad loss from, something that was kind of fundamental to Australian suburban life, 100 to 50 years ago, and it's disappeared. And that's in design. We've become very internalised. The focus has become around the TV and the backyard, and we've, even as a child, in the 70s, and we all used to play in the front yard, all the kids would come out, and you don't see that anymore. And yeah, I think as a society, perhaps we just have to demand that in design, when we're building a home or buying a home, then looking for that design aspect.
And I think, from a client point of view, it's something that, as a member of the public or someone who is employing an architect to design a home, it's something that should be in the brief. I don't have a front porch, but I have a small balcony, and I talk to my neighbours all the time. Sometimes you think, oh, is this going to be awkward? But it isn't. You just have a conversation. You feel like you're not alone. You're perhaps in a restaurant or a bar. There's someone having drinks next to you. And even the courtyards at the back of our townhouses, really bad, really bad. All our bins are there. It doesn't smell great. It doesn't look great. But each courtyard has fairy lights strung between the shade cloth. And I got home last Saturday night, and one of our neighbours was having a Halloween party. They're about my age. I walked past, one guy stuck out his hand, I high-fived him, and I walked straight into a party that I didn't know anyone but my neighbours. And that sense of community is all up to the public and those who are utilising architects or, designing their homes.
So I think on that note about walking into a party is like the great way to finish the talk. So I think we should all be walking into parties far more often.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. That was great.